Hey there, this is Erica from Ever Educating, and this channel is teaching tips, tools, ideas, and resources for new college instructors. The theme of the month is assessments, and today we're covering group projects, or group assessments. These can be tricky, so we're going to cover a few ways to design them to hopefully make them work well in your classroom. There's three types of group assignments discussed in this video. The first is the group presentation. As far as group size goes, I recommend the smaller the better, so 2, 3, maybe 4. The more students you get, the easier it is for a student to be like, hey, there's so many group members, I won't be missed. I'm going to focus on another class instead. Or if there's someone who's really excited about the group presentation, but I had to, collaborate with 5 other people. We had to vote on how we want to do things. We had to come up with all these ideas. It's a struggle because there's so many voices. So I do think smaller size works better because there are less, chefs in the kitchen, and since there's only, let's say, 3 people, one of them can say, oh, well, I'm not really needed. Well, you're a third of the presentation. You're a huge part of it. Of course you're needed. You have to put in the effort. You have to engage. So I do think smaller is better here. As far as structure options, potentially each member present on a specific concept. So you might have, hey, this is the topic of the week. Here are 5 concepts. There's 3 of you. Each of you choose one concept to present on in your presentation, though it does have to have kind of a cohesive overview of, well, how do all these 3 concepts connect? You want to make sure it flows well from one to a presentation piece to another, because it is one presentation, even though you're covering 3 concepts and each of you is in charge of one. There's also potentially each member has a specific job. So if the actual presentation, the public speaking skills, is not key to the objective, it's more that the research is important, it's more that the writing is important, and the presenting is important. It's all important, but it doesn't have to be done by all of them. Maybe they each have a job. So one person who's super anxious about public speaking is a researcher. Another one who's not a big fan of public speaking is the writer of the PowerPoint itself. And the third, who's super extroverted or super interested in practicing that skill, is the one who actually presents the information. And then another option is that all member participation flows together. So in this case, the goal is to be able to collaborate and create a cohesive piece. So maybe student A starts the presentation, then B chimes in with a certain thing, C chimes in, and then A again, C then B. Like, they have to really practice how they're all creating one really cohesive piece in the presentation. So these are potentially 3 structure options. As far as time goes, it depends on the group size. Maybe it's a 5-minute presentation by a partnership on one concept, or it might be a 15-minute presentation by a group of 3 about 3 concepts. If the assignment is really complex, they have to do a lot of research and then they have to present their findings, then that might take more time too. So it really depends on what the assignment calls for. As far as assessing the kind of group presentation, there are some options here too. So you might have that each member is graded on their portion of the presentation only. So, okay, well, student A had a really strong presentation style. They articulated really well. They brought up some really good points. They get a 95. The second group member did pretty good. They did X, Y, and Z well, but they kind of struggled with this other thing. They have an 88. And then group member 3 barely spoke, seemed to be a bit confused, had notes that they didn't really flow well from one to the next. They get, 75, right? So potentially each member gets a different grade depending on their portion. Or you might do that each member is graded on their portion as well as a total presentation, because it is important to collaborate in a group project. So it might be that 30% of their grade comes from the presentation as a whole, how did it go as a whole, and then 70% comes from their individual piece, or vice versa, depending on what matters most when you're assessing. And then along with the presentation grade, perhaps there's an individual reflection grade. So it might be, okay, 80% comes from the presentation, 20% comes from reflecting on the experience. Or maybe it's even shorter. So maybe it's 70% comes from your individual portion of it, 20% comes from the group portion, 10% comes from the individual reflection. So that's options as well for the assessment. The second option is the paper or the written assignment. Maybe this is going to be multimodal, so they're creating a website instead, or creating a newsletter, or whatever the case may be. I would say up to 3 group members for this, because the more co-authors you have, the harder it gets to have a piece that sounds like it's one voice, that it's really cohesive and flows well. So maybe this is just a partnership, but I think up to 3 could work well. As far as structure options, again, you might have that each member owns a section. So you're writing an argumentative paper. There has to be 3 points to your argument. Each of you must own one of these arguments, and then you decide amongst yourselves who writes the introduction, who writes the conclusion. Maybe the third person is then in the proofreader because they didn't do that extra step. So having that separation might be one option. Another option, if this is a writing course or a journalism course or a literature course, maybe writing skills aren't the only thing that's important, but also editing skills, proofreading, adding multimodal pieces like audio clips and videos and hyperlinks to resources. Maybe all those skills are important. So you might have 3 short group papers throughout this course. And so if there's 3 group members in the first project, one of them is the writer, one of them is the editor, and one of them is the multimodal content owner. And then the next time around, they switch roles. Now the writer is the editor is the multimodal person, the multimodal person is a writer. And then again, switch again for the third assignment. So in that case, you might have them all having a job because they're all learning those skills. And then a third option is, again, you know what? The whole thing is that it's a group paper. It's up to you to collaborate. It's up to you to make sure that you work together to create a piece that flows well. So all of you are in charge of writing a 3-page paper that does X, Y, and Z. But I want you to annotate the project. So after you write the paper, you're going to add comments, and you might say, oh, I wrote this piece based off of this research article that I found. I'm the one who edited this section after I realized that we were using there, and there wrong. I went to the one who wrote this section, and then I went back a little bit later and I proofread it and I realized this mistake. So you might have them kind of annotate their piece and give a sense of, who did what and how their piece changed as they went through the process. As far as assessing this goes, again, it depends on your structure choice, but you might just do it graded on the project as a whole. You know what? You don't need to annotate anything. You don't have to tell me who did what. I'm going to get this paper, I'm going to read it, and I'm going to grade it as if one student wrote it, because your job is to create a cohesive piece as a group. So it's going to be graded as a whole. That might be your option. Another option, though, is to have, again, that divide of, okay, I want to know who did what section, because 50% of your grade comes from your individual work, and then the other 50% comes from the project as a whole. So maybe the project itself didn't flow well. The paper had a lot of struggles with its moving from one idea to the next. There wasn't really transition phrases. There was a bit of confusion here about the research, but your section was very strong. So 70% of your grade is a 95, and then 30%, which is the project as a whole, is an 80. And then you average that out with its weight. So potentially you do it that way instead. And the third one is grading on milestones and the final project. So maybe you do want to have just the group grade, but rather than just grading the paper, you say, I'm going to grade your proposal as a group, your paper outline as a group, your first draft as a group, and your final draft as a group. And so the proposal is 10% of your grade, the outline is 10%, the first draft is 30, and then the final draft is 50. So in that case, yes, it's all a group grade, which again, some students might struggle with, but the fact that you're getting feedback on each of these 3 earlier pieces means that your final project should be very strong. And so if you put in the work, then it's less of a risk to have all the grades be based off of the group versus on individual work. And again, you can also consider having an individual reflection. This can be graded or not, but you might have a piece of, hey, tell me how the project went, right? How did you get everything to work? How did you assign roles? How did you, meet and decide on the flow of the paper, on what to focus on, etc. And maybe that's a portion of the grade as well. And then the third group project is a group facilitation. I talked about this before. I'll link those videos below. But in this case, I would say group size up to 4. 3, I think, is the ideal, but 4 works well if you want them to be able to partner inside of the group. So for example, structure options, maybe all members must facilitate. So each of you must lead a portion of the activity. Or you might have, each member has a job. So you might have, okay, there's 4 of you. One of you is in charge of researching. One of you is in charge of writing up what the students need handout-wise or resource-wise. One of you is in charge of facilitating the activity. And one of you is in charge of student support. You're answering questions. You're walking around the room and making sure everybody's on task. That's your role in this facilitation. Or you might have, if you want to do that grouping, right? So you have 4 students. 2 of you are the research writers and 2 of you are the facilitators. So they have a buddy to help them out in the group as well. And again, time-wise, it depends on group size. It depends on the purpose of the activity. I have had facilitations where their minimum is 15 minutes or even 20 minutes, and they had no max. If they wanted to go further, they could. Also, if you're teaching seniors, let's say, rather than freshmen and sophomores, then you might have, you're seniors. You need to be able to articulate and understand these concepts like the back of your hand. You're going to facilitate a 30-minute, 40-minute activity as a group. So maybe you have it as a bigger project in your senior courses. Assessing, again, you might assess on the individual facilitation. So how did your part of facilitating the activity go? Maybe you grade it on the whole. As a whole, it went well, it went poorly. These are the reasons. This is your grade as a group. Or you might, again, do it piecemeal. So if there's written pieces of it, right? So they had to do a write-up of the activity describing it or create handouts for their students. Maybe that's a group grade, right? So you're in charge of a group of creating these pieces and submitting it. So that's a group grade. And then the facilitation grade is individual. So based on how you did facilitating. And then maybe there's an individual reflection too. And that's graded individually. So in that sense, you have group pieces, individual pieces being graded in this assignment. Now, how much weight does the assignment have? If this is a 10-minute facilitation, then maybe it's only 5% or 10% of the overall course grade. Maybe it's just a group grade. But if it's a 30-minute facilitation where it's 20% of their overall course grade, maybe at that point, then you have individual and group pieces, again, for students who are wary of having a big portion of their grade based off of a group grade versus an individual grade. Now, again, this is always caveated. If you feel that your course, a major objective is being able to collaborate and work as a group, then maybe you don't do any individual grading whatsoever. Everything that's a group project, you get 1 grade because it's up to you to create a really strong piece as a group, right? And then the reverse. You have a group project in your course, but collaboration really isn't a big piece of the puzzle. So in that case, maybe you have a large portion of it is individually graded, and maybe only a small percentage is based off of the group itself. If you found this video helpful, click like and let me know, and subscribe to not miss out on future content. We have one more with the assessment theme. We're talking about ungraded assignments, which is, I know, is kind of strange to tie to assessments, but it'll make more sense once that video goes live. So subscribe to not miss out on that notification.